Hello and welcome to Susan Stanley's Stitch and Chime. I'm Susan, and on this channel I like to talk about cross-stitch, quilting, textiles, and notions from the past, and I like to share my projects with you. On today's episode, I'm going to take a look at a finish, some books that I've acquired, a quilt. I'm going to answer some comments and questions, and then we're going to have the giveaway winner. So first, let's look at a finish. I finished Mary Snow. I'm going to put a picture in right here. She was finished, and yes, for those of you who are wondering, I did frog the swan and move it down four threads. It was such a balanced sampler, and I left it out to look at, and I'd walk by it, and I just thought that line of the grass going across was just going to drive me crazy. So I originally thought maybe I would just move the grass. No. I took out the whole thing. I carefully unpicked it one evening and then stitched it up, and she's done. So I'd like to share with you what I've done since then, and then also fill you in on the plans I have for Mary Snow. So in my lifetime, when I finished a project, I always wash it and block it. And this cross-stitch projects are no different for me. Now, I will give a disclaimer that if you have used threads that you know are not stable, or linen that you know is not stable, please, please, please test those items before you attempt to do anything with water. I knew that this project, I suspected that this project was going to be safe because I knew that the linen had been dyed in a process that I believed used a mordant, and I did verify this with some shop owners and people who carry lakeside linens. But of course I was going to test it out myself. And I also knew from communicating with the distributor for Reinaissance Soie d'Alger that those threads were stable, but I was going to test it out. So I decided that Mary Snow needed to be washed before she was going to be framed. And why do I do this? Why do I wash my projects, and why am I even concerned? I know as a quilter especially that there is so much handling of the item, so much oil from your hands, so much other residue. And I've seen what happens when things have not been treated or cleaned in antiques. And so I want to try to prevent that in my projects, especially the ones that really mean something to me. I don't want to have non-existent stains pop up because there was some oil or residue from something on the fabric or the linen that didn't show up for a few years and left a nasty spot or stain. So I like to wash because I like to get that off. I like to make sure that any residual dye is gone, and that is for my quilts and for my stitching. And I think after you wash it, it calms the fibers down. If there's any fuzz or linty type effect, it definitely calms the fibers down, and it kind of puffs them out, and they fill in their little spaces for cross stitch. And for quilting, that's another issue. It draws the threads up, and I just think it makes the quilt yummy and wonderful. So like I said, I consulted with the distributor for Reinaissance, and that was Access Commodities, and communicated with them about how to handle what they felt since I was using their product. And I read on the DMC website what they, some of their suggestions, and it really wasn't too much different than how I treat a quilt. And so what did I do? Well, I'm going to show you what I did first. And the first thing I did was I took each thread that I used in the project and just did a quick running stitch through a little scrap of the linen. And I'll put a picture in right here of that. All right, and then I prepared my soap. And for this project, I used a soap that you are probably familiar with. It has to be something that's fragrance-free, free of as many dyes as possible, something that is gentle, does not contain any bleach. What I use for quilts is this product called Orvis. It's safe for your fabrics, especially if you've tested them out ahead of time. What I decided to use for my stitching to wash Mary Snow was Ivory, which is a bar soap. Now, you used to be able to buy this in flakes, but I just got some bar soap. It was very inexpensive, and it's 99.9% pure soap. So it's probably about as safe as you can get. And I'm sure there are other things you can use, but this is what I chose to use. I peeled off with a potato peeler a few shreds of it, and I'm going to put a picture in here. All right, and then I wet the sample that I had stitched to pre-moisten the fiber and the linen. And then I filled a jar with tepid water. So if you blast fabric or threads with a shot of hot water, even if it is a stable dye, you're probably going to release some of the color. So just use a soft, a nice tepid water, and I immersed my soap and I stirred it until it was melted into the water. I'm going to put a picture of that right here. All right, and then I added the thread sample and I let it sit, and I watched it to see if the color of the water was changing, if the linen looked like it was being overdyed with something. So I held the sample up after that to see if anything was happening, and it looked really good. Of course, the water was cloudy from the soap, but there was no coloration to it. Okay, so the next thing I did to make sure that there was no residual dye is I placed the strip on a pure white, 100% white cotton towel, cleaning towel. And I got these at IKEA, and I got them in a big pack. And I saved them and used them for exactly for this purpose, for either my stitching or quilting. If I want to test a fabric for quilting and make sure that it doesn't have residual dye coming out of it before I start my project, I do the same thing. So I laid this strip out on the towel and I blotted it to dry it, and I just let it sit to see if anything happened. All right, then I took Mary Snow because I felt confident that this was going to be just fine. There was absolutely no residual dye anywhere at any stage along the way. So I got a baking pan, a clear baking pan, so I could see what was going on. I filled it with tepid water and some of the ivory shavings that I had prepared beforehand, and I mixed them in until they dissolved in the water. I rinsed Mary Snow in tepid water, and then I just placed her down into the pan and patted. I don't do any swishing. I don't do any scrunching. I definitely don't do any wringing. I don't want to distort things any at all. So just pat, 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 jiggle, pat, and I'll show a picture here of what it looked like when she was floating in the water. Okay, and then I took her out of Mary Snow out of the water, and I rinsed her in the sink under tepid water. Now, if there was a lot of dye coming out of one of the threads, I would have kept rinsing and rinsing until that dye ran clear. I rinsed until all the soap bubbles went away, and I was confident that she was completely clean, completely rinsed. And then I placed her on my drying rack, and I'll show you a picture of that here. So after Mary Snow has dried almost completely, I'm going to use, I looked at Katie Strachan's tutorial that she has on her Simple Harmonies box, blocking her projects. I'm also going to draw from my knowledge of blocking for quilting, and I'm going to block Mary Snow and let her dry completely before I prepare her for framing. And so I'll be sharing that with you next time. So as you know, I'm big time into documenting my work and keeping a record, especially things that mean a lot to me. And I will be filling out my sampler stitching book. I know other people have shown this before. I'm going to hold this up. I was drawn to it because of the cover, but the inside has lines and description boxes for you to pretty much cover everything you would want to know about your finished piece for the future. Now, I probably will take this out of I will have the binding removed at an Office Depot, and I'll put it into another format so I can add more pictures, because I do want to plan on taking some pictures of my projects to put in this as well. And I think I got this on Amazon. And I'll list this below so in case you're interested. I also have been taking the tags and the information cards off of my projects when I finish them and sticking them onto this old receipt post. So it's just going to be an ongoing collection of my finishes. Anything to motivate me to keep going, right? So that's Mary Snow. Very happy to have her almost fully finished. I did acquire a few new books this time. One of them is an oldie but goodie, and I got it, it's from Thrift Books. It's by Betty Ring, American Needlework Treasures. It's a great resource for stitching. It goes through different samplers and needlework based on regions. And I was so delighted to find in the middle some information on a sample book of early stitching, where young girls would learn all the skills needed to make clothing, and they would compile them into a book. So this is something I'm really delighted to have in my collection. I did also order a book from Melissa Roberts. Now, I mentioned a blog last time called Two Threads Back, and the author of that blog is also the author of this book. And this book is called Plain Needlework, A Guide to 19th Century Hand Sewing. And I think if you are interested in this at all, I do believe Melissa has a few copies of this left. You can contact her through her blog. But it goes through the history of plain sewing including hem stitching and cross stitch and all the things that a young girl by the age of 12 needed to know to set up a household in those early 1800, 1900 years. And so if that at all interests you, I would highly recommend that you look into getting this book. And then the last book I got, I'd like to mention, ties into a question I received. And the question was, how did these girls, especially back in the times before the printing press and published materials, before books and paper items were readily available to the population, how did they get their charts? How did they know what to stitch? So there's many layers to the answer to this question, but one of them relates to this book, and this is not the earliest book, but it's called Charted Patterns of the German Renaissance, and it's Bernhard Jobin's pattern book, and this dates back to 1589. And I'm sure in some school settings this was available for young stitchers. Their mistress or whoever was teaching them to stitch would have had access to something like this. And then the rest, because we don't have information that I'm aware of on how these things were passed down, it's very much like quilt blocks. How are these things passed down? We can only get into guessing really what happened based on what materials were available. So if someone came to visit and they were working on a sampler or a quilt block and it was interesting to other people in the room, what do you think they would do? They would find any way they could to copy that pattern. They would use a piece of fabric and lay it down and trace it. They would maybe memorize it. They maybe would cut out the shapes and pin them or place them onto their fabric. There's so many things that we can guess that they did. There aren't things that we absolutely know that they did. And I think it's the same with the samplers. The little girls probably looked at what their teacher had stitched and copied it. They might have looked at what their friend next to them was stitching and copied it. They may have just been creative. I know some of the antique samplers I own, I'm pretty sure somebody was creative, because some of them are, I don't think they're published patterns. Anyway, so if you know more about the history of early pattern transmission in either of these forms, I would love to hear from you. I'm just very curious as well. So that was an excellent question, thank you, and I hope that gave you a little bit of information and also just let you know that there's still a lot to learn and still a lot to explore. I had another finish in the last 2 weeks. It was this doll quilt. This quilt is from the book Hope's Journey, and it's called Saw Blade. And as you may know, many quilt blocks were named for just common items that were used in daily life. And so I like this quilt. I wanted to experiment with these colors, this grayish black, red, and this kind of soft blue, tealy blue. And I'm happy with how it turned out. I like it, and I think after experimenting and trying it on this little doll quilt, I would venture into a larger quilt. I have a little label. I do a very narrow binding on my doll quilts. I can talk to you about that, but I'm happy with how it turned out. Of course, I love anything with red. And like I said before, I like how red and other colors play off of each other. And so this was a fun way to experiment with that. So I want to talk to you about this quilt behind me. Now this quilt is an antique quilt top. That means it does not have the batting, it doesn't have a backing, and it has not been quilted either by machine or by hand. And I did a teaser photo on Instagram earlier this week, maybe it was last week, where I showed you some up-close photos of some of the patches that were actually pieces of scraps put together to make the square. I'm going to pop in a few pictures right here so you can see what I'm talking about. This quilt is actually full of those little patched together pieces, and there's many reasons for that, but I'm going to put those pictures in right here and then I'll talk to you about it. So I'm estimating from my research and my knowledge of old antique fabrics that this quilt was pieced together. It's pieced by hand, and it was pieced in around 1870, possibly later, with some earlier fabrics. It has a lot of what we call madder and brown. Madder is kind of that coppery brown color, although madder dye was used for a lot of fabric colors. Its most distinctive color of this time period, and it ranges from really dark brown to light brown to tan to coppery orange, and even gets into some pinks. It was also a dye that was used in that beautiful red that we love, turkey red. So dark chocolate brown and a cocoa brown are also really common in this time period, and this quilt is full of those colors. The other colors that were popular at this time were some of these pinks, but it was interesting when I was doing some reading about dye during 1870, the last quarter of the century. It said that every woman had her own recipe for dyes and was able to dye muslin and linen in her home using butternut and walnut as a dye source. And I thought that was really interesting because that's probably not something, unless you're messing around with cloth in this day and age, that you have a recipe book for. Like I said, it is all hand pieced. It, of course, has the pieces that were pieced together, and that just shows you the value of textiles. These textiles were hard to come by. They were left over from dresses, from clothing. They were pieces that were remnants from possibly other household items. Rarely did you have the money to go, in many situations, and purchase yardage like we do today. So I find it charming. I love the design. I think it was very creative to do this light kind of X, and that fabric is a fabric that we lovingly call shirting. So it was used for clothing, shirts, and dresses. The borders on this quilt were torn from yardage. They were not cut, and they're torn on the grain, but the borders were not measured before they were put on. Therefore, you have this ripply effect. They were just put on and stitched and made to fit. This really simple geometric style, where this is just squares put together, was also really popular at that time. Now, why did I buy this quilt? Well, the fabrics, of course. And it's such an interesting study of all the things, some of the things that were available. And, you know, I have a lot of fun if I find an antique piece like this, trying to find something that's been reproduced from this quilt, from any other quilt, because this was not obviously the only thing that used some of those fabrics. I love looking at the techniques that were used. I love to see how they patched and put their pieces together. it's just interesting to me. From what I can tell, it was pieced with a strong linen thread, and the stitches are nice, and I'll put a picture in here of the stitching. I want to address some of the wonderful comments and questions that I received, and I do want to thank you so much. I love hearing from you. I love hearing your questions, and I love your input. So please keep that going. Last time I shared with you a mending sampler, and I did have several people just really touched by that. I think it brought back a lot of their memories of an older aunt or grandmother or mother, or maybe their own childhood experience where they were taught to mend. It is kind of a lost art, and so it really did strike a chord with several people. I had someone reach out and say that they believed it to be a European mending sampler, and I would agree with that based on my limited knowledge of it. I really don't know, but it just has that feel and the font of the letters. And then someone else said they thought that the lettering was probably transferred using a waste canvas technique. Now, I'm not familiar with that. I know there are products today, but I do plan to do a little more digging into waste canvas and finding out what that actually means. So thank you for asking about that. I also had several people ask me about batting, and that they want to know what was used in times gone by and what I like to use. And so I'll start out with what I like to use. Really depends on the project. If it's something that is not going to be washed a lot, I like wool. It has a little bit more of a loft. If I want warmth, it's a good choice. Silk is also something I like. It's easy to hand quilt and not quite as lofty, and it shows the stitches beautifully. I love silk, and I love a low loft cotton. Quilters Select, I believe, is the low loft. There's Quilters Select and Quilters Request, and they're both great. So in times gone by, what have I seen in old quilts for batting? Oh my goodness, I've seen old shredded up coverlets used as the batting of a quilt. I've seen hand carded wool where it's just kind of shredded and clumped around inside, and if the stitches didn't hold it in place, it traveled as when the quilt was washed. I've seen hand carded cotton where the seeds are still attached to the cotton fibers, and the same thing goes there. It can clump up and pool up into different sections. I've seen blankets, old blankets. I've seen worn out quilts used as a batting. So we've come a long way. We don't typically do that anymore, but those are some of the things that happened in the past. And then another question I had was regarding the Belgian linen that I talked about last week, and why was the Belgian linen used, and was it dyed? Now, to my knowledge, it was not dyed, and the flax was, I don't know what strain of flax it was, but I know that the growing conditions were ideal, and I think that's why it was so desirable. Now, of course, you can have a bad crop, and I'm sure they experienced hardships, but Belgian linen was the most desirable linen during the 1800s, from what I've read, from what I know. The other question was flax grown in the United States? And I don't know. I am not aware, and I just reach out to you and ask you, was it grown? I don't know. I'd like to know. I don't know that it was grown as prolifically as in Europe, if it was grown at all. All right. Another question was regarding this Identipen, and I want to make sure everybody is very aware that the pen you use to mark on fabric, and I will say again, you must test this on your own fabric. You must rinse it. I would heat set it, and I would check to make sure that it's not going to react to your water and your whatever you're doing in your processing, whatever was done to the fabric. I wash my fabric before I use it. The place to get the one that is made for fabric is Dharma Trading Company, and I will link that below. I was not aware that Amazon was selling a type of Identipen that is not for fabric. The type for fabric is sold by Dharma Trading Company. They deal with dyes and for fabrics and different fibers, so I would trust that source. Any other questions along those lines, please shoot them my way. Just like anything, test it out. Make sure you feel really comfortable and safe using it on your project. And now I'd like to give away the 2-year floss anniversary prizes to those lucky viewers. So I had 2 things. I had a flax pack, which was some linen and some silks. And that winner is Jennifer Kelly. Jennifer Kelly. So Jennifer Kelly, I'm going to put my email in the description box below, and if you would just please contact me, I will ship out your piece of linen and your silks. And thank you for celebrating with me and being with me for these 2 years. And the winner of the quilt pack, which you had to say the word batting. Oh, and I'm sorry, you also get this chart. The winner of that is Luella Calkins. Luella Calkins. So Luella, please go to my email. It's in the description box below. Message me that you are the winner. We'll exchange information, and I will send you this book and this curated selection of 1840s fabric. All right. Okay, so next time I will show you what I'm planning to do with Mary Snow after she's blocked and get her ready. I'm going to be getting her ready for framing. I'm going to start on Hannah Lancaster. She's kind of been in a delay, but I know what I want to use now as far as linen and floss. I'm going to continue with Mary Brutnell, and I do have some bits of history to share with you about her. The owner of Mary Brutnell and the chart designer, Rebecca of Hedgerow Stitching, has sent me some information. And I'll have another quilt to share with you, and maybe some other things as well. I don't know. So until then, make time for stitching. I'll see you soon. Bye.